I'm also happy to find myself here associated with you at St. Anthony's, which has been a hospital not only with such impressive acute facilities, but one which has had a sensitive outreach into the community. I confess I always find starting rather difficult, especially since the film of Awakenings, because people tell me I'm imitating Robin Williams. and you know, when I wasn't self-conscious about my gestures, I could be much more fluent. And then after Robin became a sort of twin, I became so self-conscious, I became almost Parkinsonian by reaction. But I'm recovering slowly now. Now, as you have been told, my life, and indeed the medical life, consists of bits and pieces. In a way, it's not a highly systematic life like the scientific life. I sometimes envy my physiologist friends who can spend 20 years examining the V4 area of the pre-striate cortex or something like this. I'd like to in a way myself, but I think I also much prefer being a doctor and not knowing what's going to happen. It may not be a systematic life, but it's an adventurous life, and it's full of challenges of all sorts. When I first went to New York in '65, I tried very hard to be a real scientist. They had this thing in the film of Awakenings about me spending 5 years with earthworms. Now this is complete nonsense. I only spent a year. Although I'm afraid I may have committed something like genocide on many thousands of earthworms around the college. I was I was interested in their large myelinated fibers, and I was trying to extract invertebrate myelin, which had never been done before. This was a very catastrophic year because I was very clumsy. I am very clumsy. One of the reasons I said I would not, they asked me if I wanted to move around the platform, and I said, no, I shall fall off, or something will happen. My mother was a surgeon. She wanted me to follow in her footsteps, but when she saw what happened around the house, and it was somewhat similar in my year as a would-be neurochemist and neuropathologist at Einstein. Everything went wrong. I kept screwing the oil immersion objectives through the slides. They said, get close, but not that close. And once I dropped some food in the ultracentrifuge. And finally, with this precious earthworm myelin, which I dedicated a whole year and 50,000 earthworms to producing, I lost it. I lost the specimen, and at that point they said, get out. You're a menace. Go see patients. They're less vulnerable. And so this is the rather ignoble start of a clinical career. Now, one of the places I was relegated to was a chronic hospital in the Bronx. Chronic hospitals were rather poorly regarded then. I think they're often poorly regarded now. They're seen as places where respectable doctors would not care to go. I had the opposite experience. At that time, our hospital, Beth Abraham Hospital, had some 500 patients with chronic neurological disease of various sorts. And some of the patients had been there for 40 or 50 years. Some of the staff had been there for 20 or 30 years. which I found unbelievable. Although now I've been there myself for 28 years, it seems to me rather all too believable. I think in a chronic hospital you have a complete world, and people come there to live and to have as much a life they can under the circumstances, and I think that you can study a person and their life and the way they can live in a sense which is very difficult to do in any other environment. But among the extraordinary patients I saw when I went to Beth Abraham in '66 were some dozens of petrified, frozen people, some of them transfixed in very strange positions. I saw them in the lobby, in the corridors, in the passages. Some were sitting, some were standing, some were in bed, completely motionless. I'd seen patients with ordinary Parkinson's disease. I'd seen catatonic patients in the psychiatric back wards, but I'd never seen patients like this. I didn't know it was possible for human beings to be so still, so transfixed. I didn't know what went on inside them, whether that was equally transfixed. I didn't know what they had. I learned that some of these patients had been in the hospital for 20, 30, 40 years. That indeed the hospital had been opened in 1920 precisely for these first victims of the viral sleeping sickness, the encephalitis lethargica. I dare say you have similar hospitals, or had similar hospitals here in Illinois, because this disease was worldwide. There was one immense hospital in London, the Highlands Hospital, a huge fever hospital covering 70 acres, and that accommodated 20,000 patients with this illness, a whole town. I'm going to show you some little excerpts from the documentary of Awakenings. Excerpts are sort of tantalizing, and I will be leaving the full-length documentary here. But I first want to this illness was illness presented in all sorts of different ways. Sometimes as excitement, sometimes as somnolence, sometimes as hiccups, sometimes as mania, sometimes as strange tics and obsessions. It required a very special sort of person, the Austrian physician von Economo, to put this together and see that this was all a single disease. Now, the first pictures I want to show you are some rather rare archival pictures, which in fact were taken by von Economo in 1918, and which I've incorporated into the documentary. Can we show?
The first alarmist reports of the new disease came at the end of the Great War. All over the world, doctors were as baffled as the press. They named it sleepy sickness after its commonest symptom, a trance-like state which often overcame its victims for years. In Switzerland, a bride fell asleep at the altar. In France, not even childbirth could rouse one mother. As the epidemic spread, other symptoms multiplied. Parents were horrified to find their children's personalities changed overnight. Doctors reported schoolgirls becoming troublesome brawlers. One victim wrote, "I feel certain that we have all been given another character, and that our own died in our sleep." But the more seriously affected suffered only a short agony. Within a few weeks, patients could scarcely talk or swallow. They became emaciated and soon died. More than 1 million during the early 20s. No cure was ever found, and 50 years later, the disease still holds as many surprises as when it first appeared.
Let's go straight on. The next segment has got a little blank.
It soon became obvious that sleepy sickness affected posture in a variety of ways. Often they seemed contradictory. Many patients had symptoms like those of Parkinson's disease, tremors and shaking of the limbs. Others were caught or frozen in whatever position they were placed, immobile and statuesque. This condition, described as the rigidity of insanity, had previously only been found in schizophrenics and other deeply disturbed mental patients, and it seemed to support the view that these patients neither conveyed nor felt the feeling of life. They had become as passive as zombies.
Well, this rather gruesome footage only represents really one presentation of what things were like for some of these patients. Some of them, as I've mentioned, were very hyper, were very active and almost convulsively active and Tourette-y. If I had time, I would have shown you another piece of film which was taken at the Highlands Hospital, this place which had 20,000 of these patients, and showed the post-encephalitic football team versus the rest. And this is quite fascinating because the post-encephalitics have a sort of pathological speed and brilliance and unexpectedness. And you see that the normals can't keep up with them. And the post-encephalitics keep scoring goals. Hewlings-Jackson in the last century sometimes talked about hyperphysiological conditions. And certainly some of the post-encephalitics were very hyper in the early days. But then this was a huge epidemic. Something like 3 to 5 million people were affected all over the world. About a third of them died in acute stages, like the patients you've seen. Others seemed to get well and then became ill later. Even those who had been very hyper slowed down, and in the late 20s and 30s, this hyper state was replaced by a state of Parkinsonism, catatonia, lethargy, depression, somnolence, trance, transfixion. I think we don't, in fact, have any exact word for the sort of standstill which some of them came to. There was an immense volume of public and medical interest in the 1920s and publication, but then by the 1930s, as a lot of these patients disappeared from view and were put away in chronic hospitals and asylums, they were forgotten. And certainly when I was a medical student and a resident, although I'd heard of the epidemic, I had no idea of its extent, and I had no idea that there were still tens of thousands, and perhaps even hundreds of thousands, of patients still alive, but so frozen and so motionless, so unable to express themselves in any way that they were just forgotten in the back wards of nursing homes and sometimes lunatic asylums and other places. Incidentally, after Awakenings was published, I heard about many dozens of such patients, or possible patients, in state hospitals who had been misdiagnosed as schizophrenic or catatonic. Sometimes after 30 or 40 years of being treated as mad and being in a state hospital, they were schizophrenic or catatonic, but they hadn't been that way to begin with. So then these were forgotten people in a strange standstill. And one of the things when they were able to talk later was they said, "Tell our story or it'll never be known." And in writing the book and with the film and in talking to you now, I feel I'm partly honoring this commitment. Let's look at the third one. Okay. This is a very short segment. This is how some of the patients appeared to me in '66. Just the eyes. This patient, Rose, is a patient whom Harold Pinter wrote about in his play, A Kind of Alaska. She'd been like that for 43 years. And this is Leonard L. This is the original Leonard L. In 1966, there was nothing medical or surgical on the whole which would be helpful for such patients. The ordinary anti-Parkinsonian medications, the anticholinergic drugs, were useful for rigidity and tremor, but not for this transfixed, this akinetic and transfixed state which the patients had. Again, some of these surgeries which were done, the thalamotomies and so forth, were also useful for tremor and rigidity, but not for this akinetic state. I might mention later, if we have some questions, that in fact there was a drug which was useful for the akinetic state and had been found by Charcot in the 1880s, but it couldn't be used until fairly recently because of its intensely nauseating effect. However, it was evident sometimes that that other circumstances could get these patients going. Sometimes music would get them going. I first realized this when I came up one Sunday morning and I heard some of the patients singing. Music was very important to them. In general, although these patients couldn't initiate, they could respond. And sometimes if one threw a ball to them, they could catch it immediately. Sometimes there were sudden spontaneous activations, which could be very startling when a patient perhaps who hadn't moved for years would suddenly get up and walk across the room and say something and appear quite normal for a minute or two, and then it would disappear. A strange phenomenon called kinesia paradoxa. These occasional awakenings showed that these were very much intact and alive individuals inside this frozen body. But tantalizingly, there was nothing for more than a few seconds which could activate them. Now, I think next I'm going to show you, incidentally, people often ask me about the movie of awakenings. They say, was it genuine or not? The answer is it's genuine in parts. And some of the parts, in particular the clinical parts, are often very exact reproductions of clinical situations. I think some of you may remember the ball playing scene in the movie. This is the original.
Sachs noticed that although the patient seemed grossly physically disabled, for brief and surprising moments, they could rediscover their lost coordination.
Watch. Let's go straight on to the next segment. The next segment is actually just Lola in slow motion. The change from Parkinsonism to readiness, as you will see with her, occurs in a single frame. And this is now at an effective speed of 90 frames per second. You cannot find an intermediate state, if you do this, between being Parkinsonian and being not Parkinsonian. So in some sense here, it is not the Parkinsonism being altered, but being bypassed. One is calling on, one's calling on a quite different sort of mechanism. Again, the beautiful carpet you have here reminds me that the patterns which were on the floor, which were done in the movie, this was also important. One found sometimes that Parkinson himself had noted, right back in 1817, that some patients could not walk in the featureless street of a town, but could walk easily in a complicated rural landscape with all sorts of what one might think were obstructions, things to climb over and negotiate. But it's precisely having to negotiate which can in a way pull one out of Parkinsonism for a moment and call on higher functions. For example, I thought that stairs would be terrible for our patients. Stairs were their favorite thing. One of our patients said, if only the world consisted of stairs. Stairs told her what to do, instructed her, commanded her, and patterns on the carpet, musical patterns, had the same effect. Early in '67, there came the first, you're a fairly young lot, but some of you may remember the enormous impact when L-dopa was announced in '67. It was touted as a miracle drug. Television programs appeared. It was in the papers. Every so often in medicine you have these great millennial things. The last time it happened before that was in the late 40s with cortisone. And cortisone was suddenly the wonder drug. Cortisone could do everything. Could make you feel good. It could extend life. And when people sort of got ulcers and TB, at first this was sort of downplayed. Anyhow, L-dopa came on the scene in early '67. Some of our patients, despite their immobility, were extremely alert and with it. Others weren't. Some of them were. Leonard L. was in this very alert state. He heard about it before I did, and he heard about L-dopa being transformed into dopamine, into the transmitter. And at that time he had a letterboard, and he only had tiny movements of one index finger. And he once tapped out to me, dopamine is resurrectamine. And at another time, when there was a program about Coatsius, the doctor who brought it out, he tapped out, Coatsius is the chemical messiah. And this will give you some idea of the desperation and the intelligence and the yearning and the irony of these patients who never expected any change in their life and who are both filled with amazement and a sort of suspicion about this new thing. I wondered whether I should use it with these patients. It had been used for patients with ordinary Parkinson's disease, but these were very different patients. I've said that some of them were very hyperactive, wildly so, in the early days. Then they cooled down. Von Economo spoke of the later stages. He said these patients had become extinct volcanoes. I didn't know if they were extinct. I wondered if they were not sleeping volcanoes. And if one uncapped them, what might burst out? Again, some of these patients had been out of the world for so long. If one had had no interaction with the world, say for 43 years, like Rose, what might happen, what would it be like existentially, socially, emotionally, if one suddenly came to? Well, I hesitated, therefore, about giving them L-dopa. I hesitated for a long time. I hesitated for 2 years. I've sometimes been seen as an eager beaver who sort of submitted these people to a human experiment. On the contrary, I delayed and delayed and delayed. I think one of the things which forced my hand was the very hot summer in '68. We had no air conditioning then, and a lot of these patients, like some patients on neuroleptics, couldn't control their body temperatures, and some of them died of heat strokes. Other patients were becoming unable to swallow. So it really seemed a life-saving measure to try L-dopa. I spoke to the patients or their relatives when I could. You know, in the 1960s, we didn't talk about informed consent. I was about to say we just did what we wanted. I confess that with one patient whom I was convinced L-dopa would help, I did have it smuggled into her milk. But mostly I try to get consent when I could. The Leonard L. was the first patient who had been, whom I put on L-dopa. And by the way, do any of you have a copy of Awakenings here? I forgot to bring a copy. I want to read a passage.
I have one, Doctor.
Oh, can I borrow it? Oh yeah, that was the one I signed earlier, wasn't it?
It's the one you signed.
I know. Okay. What I want is on page 100, I think. Okay. In the movie, you have the sort of night of the living dead, the strange Halloween-like night in which everyone is rising from their beds. Now, it didn't happen like that. But 80 patients came to over a period of 2 months. And in some cases, it was in fact much quicker than that. In some cases, it was almost instantaneous. And since Dr. Harrington has lent me his copy, I'm going to take the liberty of reading you a little bit, partly because it includes the journal kept by a patient. This, incidentally, is the patient you saw in slow motion throwing the ball back. Her name is Lola, but here I call her Hester or Mrs. Y. I'm confused with all of these names. Now, I gradually increased the dose of L-dopa. The next day, Mrs. Y exploded, as the nursing staff put it. There was no subjective or objective warning whatever. On Saturday, the 17th of May, about half an hour after receiving her morning gram of L-dopa, Mrs. Y suddenly jumped to her feet and before incredulous eyes walked the length of the ward. "What do you think of that, eh? What do you think of that?" she exclaimed in a loud, excited voice. When I spoke to an awed staff nurse a couple of days later, she told me what she thought of it. She says, "Hester's wonderful. It's just like a miracle." Actually, what she said had an additional word, as you know in the film. Throughout the course of this amazing weekend, Mrs. Y walked excitedly all around the hospital, starting conversations with fellow patients who had never heard her talk before, rejoicing ebulliently in her newfound freedom. Her capacity to chew and swallow was suddenly increased, and so too was her appetite. "Don't give me any of that slush," she exclaimed when presented at lunchtime with her usual thin soup. "I want a steak." Well done. With her right hand suddenly released from its decades-long constraint, she made the first entries in a notebook I had left with her, which I had not seriously imagined she would ever find a use for. Now I'm going to jump. Right. The first entry, made on Saturday the 17th, read, "I feel very good. My speech is getting louder and clearer. My hands and fingers move more freely. I can even take the paper off a piece of candy, which I haven't done for years." The following day she wrote, "Anyone who reads this diary will have to excuse my spelling and my writing. They must remember that I haven't done any writing for years and years." And to this she added, very poignantly, "I would like to express my feelings fully. It is so long since I had any feelings. I can't find the words for my feelings. I would like to have a dictionary to find words for my feelings." One feeling at least was straightforward. I'm enjoying my food. I feel ravenous for food. Before, I simply ate what was put in my mouth. Concluding her entries for the weekend, she summed up, is it the medicine I'm taking, or just my new state of mind? No, I think all of us sometimes have had doubts as to what is psychological and what is physiological. So much is brought out there. This was not just an absence of movement, but sometimes an absence of feeling. Oops. I didn't realize the thing was on. But that is in fact Lola, but let's put it on now.
Lola, who was unable to swallow solid food and was threatened with starvation. She was first given L-dopa in May 1969 in the hope of keeping her alive. It did much more than that.
Lola had been transfixed in a state of extreme, really in a state of infinite Parkinsonism and catatonia for decades. And her change, her awakening, occurred in seconds. And she jumped out of the chair, and she flew down the passage, and she burst into conversation. And it was an incredible scene, and I would doubt my own memory were it not supported by everyone else's memory, and of course by our accounts and films and so forth, which we took at the time.
The most dramatic awakening came in July with Sylvia. After 35 years in hospital, frozen and inert, she regained the enthusiasm for life which had deserted her 40 years before. But something in her manner was strange. Sachs noted in his diary, is it possible that Sylvia has in fact never moved on from the past?
She was in a marvelous mood for a while, and she was talking away and singing and dancing, but almost everything she said and did had reference to 1926 or before. She referred to figures who were topical at that time. Some of her mannerisms, some of her slang was of a sort which had been obsolete for 40 years. She was, so to speak...
Oh, okay. I was about to say she was a flapper come to life. Yes, if we can hold it for a little bit. Yeah, especially when I see my younger self there, I realize that we are updated all the while. Is it a strain on that thing to hold that picture? Yes. Like that. Well, actually, let's. It's a strain on me. Let's go to the end of that segment. I shouldn't have stopped in the middle.
Summer months, the patients came back to life. Their childish gaiety and enthusiasm shattered the hospital routine.
Okay. I'm sorry for the rather degraded sound here. I made these excerpts from the full film, and I think there's been some degradation. But as I say, the full film will be here. In the full film, also, after I talk about Sylvie being a flapper, she sings an obscene song from the 20s. I'm sorry I don't have it here, but you can see it. Now, as I say, we are updated, for better or worse. it's the nature of creatures to be updated, and as they do so continually to sort of to recategorize all their experiences and to bring their world up to date. One of the very startling things with some of these patients, and this was particularly clear with Sylvie, is that in some cases they had not been updated and therefore in a sense belonged to a much earlier time. As I mentioned, Sylvie sort of spoke of Gershwin and others from the 1920s as if they were contemporaries. She had the behaviors and the gestures and the speech of a much earlier period. We wondered if she was disoriented, asked her some questions. She was a very quick woman, and she said, she said, I can tell you the date of Pearl Harbor, I can tell you the date of Kennedy's assassination. She said, these things have registered, but she said, they don't seem real, they're not part of me. She said, I know it's 1969, but I feel it's 26. I know I'm 64, but I feel I'm 21. She said, I've been a spectator for the last 43 years. I think this sort of radical spectatorship, in which in fact nothing is appropriated, and you stay the same and may just get glimpses of a world, but without any sense of history or time, may not occur in any other condition. But it is very extraordinary physiologically and existentially. And of course it gives rise to profound problems, which the rest of us, I think, can hardly imagine. If we arrive, well, I admitted I was born in 33, okay, I'm going to arrive at 60 in a month or so, but I've sort of, it's been a steady path. I've known what it was like to be 20 and 30 and 40 and 50. I've liked it less and less, but you know, but I've had some warning. Whereas you see with Sylvie, she, as it were, was 21 one moment and 64 the next. In some sense, the middle had been missing. She wasn't in a coma, she wasn't completely out of it, but in some essential sense, nothing had happened, and she hadn't been updated. With most of the patients, the first awakening was something of great delight. It was close to resurrecting, as Leonard had said. And the sheer physicality of breathing and moving and feeling and colour and smell and wind. I very much like that touch in the movie when De Niro sort of feels the fan blowing on him. In some sense there was no sense of movement before. And as you see from that brief dancing scene, these were not just individuals coming out of their cocoons, but they immediately related to one another. It was an immensely companionable time, one in which they could share experiences, and it was a sort of wonderful sort of convalescence for a while. But then, now, there was one point, and this is in fact the point at which part one of the full documentary ends. There was one point at which everything looked very good in the summer of '69. The patients were doing well. One wondered, will this last? Can they hold it? Will there be homes they can go back to? Will it be possible for them to have meaningful lives from now on? But then problems occurred. Problems really of two sorts. And in a way, although perhaps this was being wise after the event, the problems one had feared when L-dopa first came along. First, they could not hold the effect physiologically, or most of them could not. One started to see fluctuations. Lola would sometimes have 30 or 50 fluctuations a day, in which she would suddenly go in a split second from a very turned on, aroused, almost frenetic state, of which you'll see an example, to a completely motionless one. And it was as sudden as turning off a light switch. Many of the patients also developed sort of strange tics and compulsions and complex movements, usually different from the sort of chorea which one sees with patients with ordinary Parkinson's disease. Some of these were movements which they'd had at the time of the acute epidemic. You'll see one point a very strange breathing pattern with gasping and panting and explosive expirations. When I saw this, I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know if I was seeing hysterical overbreathing or something cardiac or metabolic or asthmatic. And it was only when this patient said, "This is what happened in 1919, that I realized I was seeing a so-called respiratory crisis. Something like a third of these patients had had central respiratory disorders, but mostly these had disappeared by the end of the 20s. But here, one of these central respiratory disorders was being brought back. It was a sort of fossil symptom. So there were... I struggled desperately to stabilize the patients, giving a bit more L-dopa, giving a bit less L-dopa, altering the timing, putting it in different vehicles. You know, there's only one correct dose of medication, and that's enough. And it was enoughness which was disappearing. They were sort of decomposing into too muchness and not enoughness, pulling apart. And I don't think we had the phrase therapeutic window, nice phrase, but the therapeutic window, the therapeutic door, whatever, was getting smaller and smaller. There are various reasons for this, but I think probably the essential one is that in these patients, unlike patients with ordinary Parkinson's disease, you must envisage, you know, a very nearly total destruction of some of the regulatory systems. The involvement of substantia nigra and some other systems, in fact, eluded detection in ordinary Parkinson's disease for a century. It's relatively subtle in some ways. It was discovered in these post-encephalitic patients. In some of these patients, you must imagine 99.9% of the nigrostriatal systems wiped out. Maybe the remaining 1% can respond beautifully to L-dopa, but you can't hold together on 0.1%. You start to come apart. Let's look at the next section.
Good health decomposed abruptly. Tics, nightmares and long-forgotten symptoms flourished, apparently independent of the amount of L-dopa administered. The ward became a bedlam. Sachs was faced with the enigma of a drug which could restore health to Parkinsonian patients after 40 years, and yet snatch it away again in weeks.
Let's, I think, go on to the next segment.
Today, the effects of L-dopa are neither as dramatic nor as terrible as they were in 1969, and Lola has survived both the elation and disappointment of the initial treatment. She is no longer speechless or unable to swallow, but her behavior is fragmented and unstable. 20 or 30 times a day, like a yo-yo, she jumps from remorseless activity to a passive, frozen state, in which the slightest move demands intense effort.
Lola, this is the Mrs. Y whom I originally read from. Lola was one of the most extreme of these patients, in almost from the start not having any intermediate state. As I indicated from what I read, she turned on like that, and between turning on and turning off and switching from one state to another, there really weren't any intermediate states. I should say that, and this will be evident if you read the case history of Hester, as I call her in Awakenings, this was an exceptionally tough, fine, funny person. And in a quite amazing way, she was able to accommodate all of these changes and was certainly capable of very warm, deep relationships. In a way, she had been the center, the fulcrum of her family when she became ill. And as she became ill, her family, in a way, broke up. And it was immensely moving to see them come together again many years later when she was there. Physiologically, so wild, there was sort of nothing between these ticking states and frozen ones, and yet a very full human being. We did what we could with medications then. Different sorts of, sometimes we tried dopa antagonists, like Haldol, haloperidol. This tended to switch all the effects of L-dopa off and not dissect out some of them. Incidentally, haloperidol is in some ways rather like L-dopa in reverse, as Tourette syndrome can be somewhat like frozenness in reverse. We tried all sorts of other drug combinations, but there was a very severe limit to what could be done. On the other hand, it became more and more clear, and I think this was the point where things moved from a sort of a chemical scenario into a general human and existential one. All of the things which can give a life meaning and stability and structure also worked for these people, and sometimes in a most amazing way. This was extremely clear with one patient, the one I call Marwan in the book, who had been a cobbler, shoemaker, and he turned on with something of the same suddenness as Lola, and then, like Lola, started to go into these fluctuations. But then when we set up in our sheltered workshop a sort of cobbler's bench and last, and suggested that he work, he became much stabler. And patients came to him at first sort of trying to humor this sick man with their shoes, and they discovered he was very good. And in work, he recovered a sort of stability which drugs alone couldn't help him with. And one realized more and more with patients like this that health is not just a level of a drug, but it has to do with the fullness of a life, the structure of a life, and meaning and relationships. And very much the effort, although of course drugs continue to be needed, was to search for ways of finding a worthwhile identity in life for these people. It wasn't always possible. With poor, I keep thinking of the real name, poor Sylvie, poor Rose, whom you saw, the flapper. Well, she said it. She says, "I don't like your world." She said, "Everything which had meaning for me has vanished." And 10 days later, she went into that strange, entranced, catatonic state you saw earlier, and though she lived another 10 years, neither giving her L-dopa nor anything else budged her. Sometimes with patients like this, I don't know how much is motive and how much is physiology, although in patients like this, the life conditions and the physiology are so closely linked. whenever things were good or possible, these patients became hugely better. And whenever they were difficult or stressed or they got hopeless, they got hugely worse. And to some extent, the entire floor, we had actually 2 floors of 36 patients on each floor, but all 70 patients sometimes acted like a single organism. The whole community would sort of stabilize or destabilize. It was very important that they feel themselves a community, and they had communal meetings and a sort of sense of autonomy. I think, let me show one more segment. This will just give you some idea of the sanity and humor of one of these patients.
The patients must adapt to the disconcerting side effects of L-dopa. Each morning, as the drug begins to work, Lillian's head rocks uncontrollably from side to side.
How are you this morning?
Okay. Fine.
What's it like doing your hair when your head's shaking like that?
It's not bad. Bounces around.
So how do you manage to do it if it bounces around?
Kind of follow it around. Devil putting a part in, though.
Okay, let's stop it now. One of the things I didn't quite like about the movie of Awakenings was that for dramatic purposes it showed everything opening and then closing, and irrevocably, in 1969. Maybe they were influenced by Charlie, by Flowers for Algernon. Although I'm afraid this did happen for Leonard L. In a way, the 2 patients who have been selected for dramatic adaptation, Leonard L. and Sylvie Rose, were both people with a tragically short time, who then went back to the shadows for whatever reason and stayed there. Most of the patients didn't. Most of the patients, one way and another, and with help, negotiated this evil time in the fall of '69, and although they were never as great as they'd been in that sort of first manic resurrection, yet many of them had many good hours of life each day and were able to go out and meet people and do things. And one such patient was Lillian, whom you saw there. And Lillian, in fact, sort of met the actors for the film of Awakenings, and she came along to the film set. And people had been in this sort of Hollywood dream world, and I don't know whether they entirely believed that any such thing had ever happened. And when Lillian came, they wanted to touch her and to ground themselves. She was real. She showed it was all real. And they said, "What are you doing here in 1990? We thought it was all over in 1969. Actually, she did a scene with De Niro. It was, she herself still alternated between these hyper states and turned off ones, and after being very talkative earlier and also throwing things around the studio in the irrepressible way which one may do when one is turned on, she froze into a sort of catatonic state. And then when De Niro was wheeled in and took up his catatonic state, he was a bit nervous. I'd never seen him discomposed before. He's a man of immense composure, but I think probably having one's actual model 2 foot away might be enough to throw even an actor like De Niro. And I wondered what she was thinking. I saw her eyes turn quizzically, and she watched him. The eyes are the only thing which can be free in this. And then she could hardly move, but she gave me a tiny, tiny little thumbs up sign, which meant he's okay, he's got it. I'm very sorry that scene wasn't used in the actual movie, but I guess Penny had her reasons. In some way, Lillian coming to the movie seemed to me, and even though it wasn't used in the final product, it was an essential part of the process. It was sort of the moral center of the filming, and it somehow linked this whole long story together with the film. And this is the story I've tried to give you, one which started in the First World War, which affected so many people and drove them into these strange, terrible, isolated, abandoned states. And then this new chapter of the story with L-dopa and awakenings, this bittersweet thing. Lillian died a few months ago. She is the last of the original group. And I doubt if one will ever see such patients again, although this is a disease which has occurred and recurred occasionally in the past. Perhaps it occurs sporadically. No two patients were the same. They showed me, and they showed all of us, more about disease and neurological disorder than any other patients. But they also showed us more about adaptation and toughness and resilience and health and just about being human and being alive. And of all the bits and pieces in my own life, this has been the one which has moved me the most. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really wonderful.